St. Louis, early 2000s. Women were disappearing. Bodies turned up in woods, drainage ditches, even landfills. Police knew a serial killer was on the loose, but no one could find him until an anonymous letter arrived at a newspaper, along with a map that pointed to a burial site. They traced the IP address, and the name Maury Travis came up. Then came the real horror. Inside Travis's home, police discovered a basement of death. And in that basement, videos, footage showing Travis tying up, torturing, and murdering women. In that very room, a room under what used to be his house. A house that had been rented out to Katrina McGaw. She had no idea she was living above a torture chamber. No idea she slept above the same floor where women were chained and killed on camera. The stairs, the table, the entire layout was identical. And the woman who handed her the keys? Maury Travis's own mother. Though he was officially charged with just 2 murders, Travis may have killed at least 17 women, leaving some in the basement, discarding others like trash. Before he could be tried, he took the coward's way out, hanging himself in jail. He took all his secrets with him. But what we know is chilling enough. It's time to step into the dark, into the world of Maury Travis. Before he became a monster, he was just a boy. Maury Travis was born in St. Louis, Missouri, and raised in the city's public school system. Neighbors described him as a polite, well-behaved child, with no signs that he would grow into a killer. He didn't harm animals. He didn't set fires. Nothing out of the ordinary. In fact, Travis fit in quite well. After high school, he served in the Army Reserves, working as a medical and dental assistant, a job built around healing. But somewhere along the way, something inside Travis broke. It may have started when he began using cocaine during his college years. By 1989, the quiet boy was gone. In his place, a criminal, Travis was arrested for armed robbery and spent years behind bars. After being paroled and released, he took a job as a hotel waiter, polite, reserved, and nearly invisible to the outside world. But inside his home in Ferguson, Missouri, was a very different story. Behind closed doors, Travis had been quietly building a room, a dark basement dungeon designed for captivity, torture, and murder. From 2000 to 2002, Maury Travis began hunting and killing the most vulnerable women. He lured them in with promises, a friend, some money, or just a quiet night. But what they received was a one-way trip into hell. The basement of Travis's home wasn't just a crime scene. It was a stage. And Travis, a twisted director, orchestrated every frame. He tortured victims for hours, sometimes days, and recorded every moment of agony on VHS tapes. That's why, later on, investigators gave him a chilling nickname, the videotape killer. Travis was officially charged with only 2 murders, but in an anonymous letter he once sent, he hinted that he had killed 17 victims. And investigators believed the real number could be even higher. Travis didn't just kill. He taunted police, sending anonymous letters and deliberately leaving clues. But in one careless moment, he left behind a digital trace. And that mistake led police straight to him. When officers searched Travis's home in Ferguson, they uncovered something horrifying. Not just a real-life torture chamber, but dozens of videotapes capturing the crimes. Footage that even the most seasoned detectives would never forget. One tape, sitting harmlessly in the living room, was labeled "Your Wedding Day." It sounded sweet, but it wasn't a wedding video. Inside, investigators found footage of a woman, tied up and blindfolded with duct tape, gasping for air as Travis strangled her with a belt. His voice was calm, methodical, even mocking. He wasn't wearing a mask. He looked straight into the lens, proud of what he had created. This wasn't a moment of blind rage. It was a performance, a carefully scripted act. In some of the tapes, Travis even forced his victims to say their names before he killed them, as if he needed complete control over them, not just physically, but over their very identity. He stripped everything away: freedom, dignity, even their voice. One of the most terrifying parts wasn't the bodies that were found. It was in the videotapes he left behind. As police reviewed the footage, even the most seasoned investigators couldn't endure it. Some later required psychological counseling. The horror captured on those tapes was raw, unfiltered, and relentless. And that ... was just one of many. In the dark labyrinth of Maury Travis, there were two victims whose identities were confirmed. Two women, representing dozens more, now only remembered by the places where their bodies were found. Alicia Greenway was one of them. The last time she was seen alive was in Missouri. No one knew what happened to her until April 1st, 2001, when her body was discovered across the state line in Illinois. She hadn't just gone missing, she had been abducted, possibly lured by a man who seemed harmless, someone you might pass on the street and never think twice about. But when she was found, her voice had been silenced forever. She had become a part of Travis's twisted machinery, taken to his basement, tortured, and discarded like trash in another state. Then there was Betty James. Like Alicia, she vanished without a trace. But this time, the story reversed. Betty was last seen in Illinois. Weeks later, her body turned up in Missouri. Yet another woman whose path crossed with Maury Travis, and who never came back. Another soul taken by a predator who treated state lines like the borders of his personal hunting ground. These victims, they weren't just names in a file. They were real people with histories, with families, with hopes and dreams that never had the chance to grow. But their lives ended in the darkest way imaginable, at the hands of someone who didn't just kill, but recorded it all in the most degrading, twisted fashion. And the terrifying part, he wasn't finished. Not until one small mistake brought everything crashing down. Maury Travis's rage didn't explode overnight. It was a slow, deliberate descent into depravity, one that began in the late 1990s. He didn't choose his victims at random. Travis had a type. He hunted vulnerable women, the ones society had pushed to the margins. But his victims weren't simply unlucky. They were chosen, one by one, because they could be forgotten. Because if they disappeared, no one would sound the alarm. These women lived on the edge of society, where circumstance and stigma made them nearly invisible. And for Travis, that was the perfect cover to satisfy a brutal hunger without fear of being caught or punished. Once you stepped into Maury Travis's car, there was no coming back. For those women, the ride wasn't a beginning. It was a silent death sentence. But it wasn't just the car that sealed their fate. It was the journey, one that led to absolute despair, that revealed who he truly was. Travis drove them to remote places where no one could hear their screams. Deep woods, abandoned houses, places where the darkness swallowed both hope and final cries for help. It was there the monster in him was unleashed. The pain he inflicted wasn't just about killing. It was deliberate, prolonged, brutal, and perverse. For hours, the women endured both physical and psychological torment. Travis didn't just rape. He crushed their will, piece by piece, as if to force them to understand that they were utterly helpless and completely alone. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was the work of someone who took pleasure in slow destruction. And when the pain had reached its peak, he would strangle his victims, slowly, methodically, coldly, snuffing out their lives like a dying light. Their final moments held no hope, only fear and breathless silence in the dark. But Travis didn't discard the bodies carelessly. He disposed of them with chilling calculation. The victims were left in places society had long forgotten, just as these women had been invisible in life. Abandoned buildings, nameless woods, the darkest corners of St. Louis, that's where he buried his crimes. And what allowed Travis to evade justice for so long wasn't just the hidden locations. It was the victims themselves, women the world considered unworthy of being found. These horrifying crimes, which should have shaken the city, became just background noise in a place already drowning in despair. No breaking news, no protests, no outrage. Just bodies discovered one by one and forgotten just as quickly. Maury Travis wasn't just a serial killer. He was a master manipulator, someone who knew how to hide in plain sight, lure in the most vulnerable, and turn them into prey. Each victim, each body, was a piece in the horrifying puzzle Travis was quietly building. A picture that only became clear after years of death, pain, and disappearance. Imagine a city consumed by a nameless fear. Women vanishing, no clues, no sounds, no traces. A monster was lurking, but not in the shadows. He was hiding in plain sight. Time passed. Leads went cold. The body count rose. And still, he walked free. But the police didn't stop. They built a strategy, methodical, quiet, determined. A surveillance net was cast, focused on the areas where women had gone missing. Quiet streets became silent traps. Officers waited in the dark, watching, documenting, looking for anything that could finally tie Travis to the crimes. This was no longer an investigation. This was a hunt, long, tense, and dangerous. And they knew one mistake. That's all it would take. And the game would be over. But the breakthrough didn't come from surveillance vans. It didn't come from the streets officers had staked out for weeks. It came from what seemed invisible, a strand of hair, a piece of fabric, a nearly smudged fingerprint. Crime scenes were scoured. Every trace, no matter how small, was collected, analyzed, and compared. DNA samples, forensic photographs, fiber evidence. This was no longer a typical investigation. It was a decoding process, a puzzle, and every piece was soaked in blood. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became. Travis wasn't a spontaneous killer. He had a pattern, a method, a system. The cases began to line up. Crime scenes were mapped, and a chilling truth emerged. He didn't pick his victims at random. Everything, from the moment of contact to the dumping site, was calculated. That's when they introduced the new weapon, geographic profiling. By connecting where the victims were last seen, where their bodies were found, and where they were likely abducted, experts began to define Travis's hunting ground. By connecting the locations where victims were found, where they were last seen, and where their bodies surfaced, experts began to visualize Travis's territory. There was no doubt now. He had a killing ground. And within that familiar area, he was most confident, striking again and again. The goal was no longer just to find him, but to stop him before another woman vanished. The investigation quickly grew beyond the scope of any one local police department. The crimes crossed multiple jurisdictions, and the predator they were hunting didn't respect city lines. Authorities formed a multi-agency task force, bringing together detectives, analysts, and investigators from various departments. They pooled every resource, every ounce of experience, every tool and tactic, all aimed at one objective: to bring down Maury Travis. No detail was ignored, no clue dismissed, because they were chasing a shadow, a man who had hidden in plain sight for years, without leaving a clear trace. But there was one thing they hadn't anticipated. Several of Travis's potential victims were still alive. These were women who had escaped him. They knew exactly what he was capable of, but fear kept them silent because they believed he was still out there. Police couldn't wait for someone to talk. They had to move before another woman vanished. Undercover officers were sent into the city's most dangerous zones, where sex workers and addicted women were the easiest targets. They posed as clients, started conversations, issued quiet warnings, and noted every single detail that might lead to Travis. This wasn't a routine investigation anymore. This was a hunt, a dangerous one, a deadly gamble, where even the smallest mistake could mean one more body. As the task force pushed to their limits, time became their greatest enemy. They knew they were closer than ever before. Every lead, every shred of evidence was pointing in one direction. But while police followed the trail, Maury Travis got bolder. He no longer hid in the shadows. He began taunting the system itself, and that arrogance was exactly what police had been waiting for. As mentioned earlier, the map Travis sent to the newsroom could be traced back to his personal computer. This wasn't just a taunt, it was a fatal mistake. The mistake that would seal his fate. From May to October 2001, the nightmare that was Maury Travis continued to spread. 4 more women became his targets, tortured, strangled, then vanished without a trace. Teresa Wilson, Verona Thompson, Yvonne Cruz, Brenda Beasley. These women didn't just disappear. They became pieces in a deadly pattern, meticulously planned by Travis over the course of months. But everything began to shift when Teresa Wilson's story landed on the front page of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And Travis, still watching from the shadows, responded. He sent an anonymous letter to the newsroom. Enclosed was a computer-generated map. He signed it, I Thraldom, a strange name, referencing a dark website, like a twisted psychological game. But that very map became the key to solving the case. One small mistake, one accidental click, and the police were able to trace the IP address, the computer, and finally, the real identity of Maury Travis. They had traced the map's origin, and no one else but Travis himself had unknowingly led the police straight to his own front door. In a letter to the newspaper, he arrogantly bragged about his killing spree. I'll let you know how many more there are. To prove I'm real, here are directions to number 17. Number 17, a number, a sentence, but it marked the beginning of the end. When police raided Maury Travis's home, they uncovered a horrifying truth. A torture chamber in the basement, fully equipped with restraints, stun guns, and a wide array of tools built for one purpose only, inflicting pain. They found newspaper clippings about the murders, carefully saved, like twisted trophies. But the most horrifying discovery was the tapes. On them, Travis mocked, tortured, and brutalized his victims with an almost chilling detachment. After analyzing the evidence, authorities linked him to at least 12 murders, including Mary Shields and Cassandra Walker, 2 women killed within just a year. But that wasn't the full story. 4 more unidentified bodies were found the following year. That brings the known total to at least 17 victims, and possibly more. His hands were soaked in too much blood. On June 7, 2002, Maury Travis was arrested. But just 3 days later, before his court appearance, before facing the families of the women he destroyed, Travis took his own life in his jail cell by hanging himself. He escaped the courtroom, but he didn't escape the truth. Justice would never be complete, but the horror he unleashed would never be forgotten. In his suicide note, Maury Travis apologized to his mother, the only person he seemed to show any remaining emotion for. He confessed he'd struggled with mental illness since he was 14, but the apology came far too late. The bodies, the tapes, the desperate cries for help. He left them all behind. More than a decade later, a woman named Katrina McGaw moved into what seemed like a cozy, quiet apartment. Until one day, while watching a documentary about serial killers, she was stunned to recognize a familiar scene on screen. It was the house she was living in. The very house where victims had been tied up, tortured, and killed. A place that once echoed with screams and desperate pleas before falling silent forever. That house, she discovered, belonged to Sandra Travis, the mother of Maury Travis. Katrina immediately broke her lease and moved out, never to return. Travis's death had closed any chance of putting him on trial, and with it, silenced the final voices of his victims. Even in death, he left behind a chilling legacy, one that haunted the families, the investigators, and anyone who ever stepped into the darkness he left behind. And then, in one last cruel twist of fate, Travis, despite being on suicide watch, still found a way to escape justice. He was supposed to be checked every 15 minutes, but 2 consecutive checks were missed by the guards. A few minutes was all it took, and he chose to end everything in silence, just as he had once buried the screams of those he killed. But the scars he left behind won't fade so easily. How many truths are still buried? How many wounds remain without answers? If you have any thoughts about the case of Maury Travis, share them in the comments below, because sometimes you might see something others have missed. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. I've got so many more cases coming, and trust me, you won't want to miss them.